Okay.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vasu Sharma, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session on Voices of Healthcare Cloud. Voices of Healthcare Cloud is a webinar series that myself and my two colleagues, Shelly and Josh, have put together with the sole purpose of finding use cases relevant to the healthcare industry that you can solve for using Teams, Office 365, and the connected Microsoft Cloud. Today, we're going to have a very special presentation by one of our architects, and I'll let him introduce himself here shortly. His name is Andrew, and he will talk about how to do automated role-based scheduling using shifts. Now, before we start, a few housekeeping items. We do highly encourage you all to ask questions. So go ahead and use the Q&A panel on the right-hand side, and I'll show you where that lives. All questions are moderated. So unless we decide to publish those questions, they may not show for everybody else. This webinar is going to be recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing out on something. You can get the recording on this link, aka.ms/HLSblog, essentially on the original blog post that had the invitation in the first place. Very quickly, I'll walk you through how to engage with the Q&A panel. You'll see in the top right of your screen this little question mark icon. So you can click on it, and that will let you into this type of screen where you can ask your question either anonymously or with your name attached. So feel free to leverage this space as we work through the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew here. Andrew, take it away, maybe do a quick intro, and then let's dive right in.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Vasu. Let me know when you can see my screen.
Yep.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Andrew Roger. I work as a technical architect out of the Seattle Microsoft Technology Center, where we aim to help empower our customers' digital transformation through deep technical engagements. I'm excited to be here today with you all to talk about automated role-based scheduling in Teams. But I know that the topic of automated role-based scheduling might be something that is unclear to everyone on the call, or maybe just the definition of what automated role-based scheduling might not be super well defined in everybody's head. But the goal of today's session is to discuss what this is and also how you can achieve it inside of Teams with the help of a few other different technologies. So we'll also take a look at shifts for Teams as well as Power Automate. So that's kind of the goal of the day. With that, I can get into the agenda for our session. So we'll start with an overview of shifts for Teams and Power Automate, these two technologies that will help us enable this role-based scheduling inside of Teams. That should take about 10 to 15 minutes. I think it's really important that before we just jump into a use case or a demonstration, that we discuss the kind of technologies that we're going to be showing so that everyone has a clear understanding of kind of what they are and how they work. After that overview, we'll switch into a use case discussion. So we'll spend about 5 or so minutes talking about a particular use case where we can set up this automated role-based scheduling. And that use case is all going to be all around a COVID vaccination clinic and how we can manage the scheduling of volunteers within that COVID vaccination clinic. And then we'll move into a demonstration that should take about 15 to 20 minutes, and we'll wrap up with a Q&A. But I highly encourage you throughout the session, as questions come up, submit those to the Q&A as Vasu shared, and he can, he'll share those with me as we go through. So you don't have to wait until the end to ask your questions. Okay, so let's get into the overview of shifts for Teams. And so Shifts in Teams is a first-party Teams application that allows you to completely digitize the shift management and time tracking processes right from within Teams. We can start by maybe talking about some challenges that are associated with these more traditional scheduling processes. And a lot of these traditional scheduling processes can be outdated. And these processes might include, creating a physical schedule and then distribute a paper-based schedule and distributing that to different physical locations, or maybe creating a schedule and distributing it via email. And these outdated processes can lead to really cumbersome methods for managers and frontline workers, employees to have to go in and update the schedules. So if I create a schedule, send it out in email, and I need to go back and update it, that involves a lot of emails back and forth between a manager and their team. There's also some time clock and clocking in, clocking out related functionality inside of shifts for teams that can help address inconsistency caused by these manual processes. But we're going to be focusing more on the shift management side of shifts and less on the time clock functionality inside of shifts for teams. And so shifts for teams can help address these challenges in a few different ways. First, it again completely digitizes the shift management process. So a manager can go into Teams and put together a schedule for their team from any device that has access to Teams, and then share this out with all members of their team, and then manage it centrally in one location. Next, it can help empower frontline workers to really own their own schedules. And so there's a lot of self-service tools that have been built into shifts for teams to make the experience better for these frontline workers accessing their schedules. And we'll talk more on those functionalities. So let's dive a little bit deeper into shifts for teams. Now, each schedule that you create in shifts is always based around a specific team. So for a given team in Microsoft Teams, you can easily create a shifts schedule from scratch, or if you have an existing schedule in Excel, you can import that into shifts. Now you can see this kind of image of what a shift schedule looks like on the right side of your screen. So you can see the shifts in the middle and then the members of the actual group or team here on the left side of the screen. Once you've created your schedule, we can create groups within a given schedule. And so you can use these groups to track shifts for a particular job function or even maybe a particular location and keep these groups organized. So each group gets to have its own unique schedule within the team. So you can see that this is the schedule for the Contoso East team. And there's a group here for cashiers, and this cashiers group gets its own unique schedule, and we could create different groups to track different kind of schedules for other job functions or maybe cashiers at a different location. Once you have your team and you have these different groups, you can easily go in and create shifts, and you can create shifts manually, or you can copy and paste from existing shifts. So if you want to create a template for a specific day and then copy and paste that out over a week or even a month, you can do that through the UI. One other concept that I want to cover is the concept of open shifts. So it might be a little bit small on the screen here, but you can see at the top, there is this row for open shifts. And so these are the shifts that a manager can put on the calendar, and any employee can come and request one of these open shifts. There's a certain number of slots associated with the open shifts. And once an employee actually requests one, then the manager can go in and approve the request or reject it. And if the manager approves it, then it will be put onto the employee's calendar. Now, once the manager has put together their schedule, they can share it out or share out a certain range of the schedule with all members of their team. All right, so we mentioned that shifts for teams can help simplify the experience for the frontline worker. And so on the leftmost image there, you can see what the view is for the frontline worker who's coming in to view their schedule. They can see their schedule, they can see the schedule of all of their other teammates, and they can also see these different group schedules that have been created within this one team. Now from the Teams app, the frontline worker can also request time off. They can go in and they can offer to swap shifts with other members of the team, and they can set their availability also all from the Teams app on the go. The frontline worker can also grab these open shifts, like I mentioned earlier on the previous slide. Okay, so with that, I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about Power Automate, and then we'll get into our use case. But before I do that, let me check in. Any questions from the attendees, Vasu, about shifts?
Can you go back a slide and maybe do a quick comment on the workforce management systems and what does it mean to integrate any of these with shifts?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that you can kind of extend and customize shifts for teams. You can do so through Power Automate, like we're going to see. You can also do so with the Graph API. And then there's also a set of kind of workforce management systems where you can integrate these with shifts for teams as well to kind of customize shifts for teams for your organization.
Thanks, Andrew.
Any other questions?
There is a question about, is Shift compatible with Workday for Epic? And I'll just respond offline unless you wanted to add something.
No, yeah, I think just a response offline will do. Okay, so let's go forward. Let's talk a little bit about Power Automate. This is the other kind of component of this automated role-based scheduling that we're going to get into, but it's hard to talk about Power Automate without talking about the Power Platform as a whole. And for those of you that are not familiar, the Power Platform is a single low-code platform that spans Office 365, Azure, and Dynamics. Now, on the platform, there's 4 different kind of products that make it up. One of those is Power Automate, and I'll come back to talk about Power Automate. But we have Power BI for business analytics, Power Apps for rapid application development in a no-code, low-code environment, and then Power Virtual Agents for creating intelligent chatbots with little to no code. Now, Power Automate is our workflow or process automation tool on the Power Platform, and it allows you to create low-code workflows to do things like approvals or customize any of your business processes, right? All in this no-code to low-code environment. So we'll dive deeper into Power Automate, how Power Automate works. But I also want to mention these data connectors. You can see this component down at the bottom of the screen, and within Power Automate, you get out-of-the-box access to over 400 different data connectors that give you seamless, secure integration to these 400 plus different data services. And so these data connectors give you a lot of flexibility in Power Automate with what different services and data sources you can automate around. Now, every Power Automate that you are going to create will have 3 different building blocks: a trigger, which is how that Power Automate is actually kicked off, a set of actions, what is that Power Automate going to go and do, and then generally some conditional logic to guide these actions along the way. Now, when you go to create a Power Automate, you can choose from one of 3 types of triggers. You can have a manual trigger, meaning you're configuring your flow or Power Automate to only run when you actually go in and explicitly press a button. You can have a Power Automate that runs on a schedule. So maybe you want a workflow to run every day, every week, every month. You can configure that with a scheduled trigger, or you can have an event-driven trigger. And these event-driven triggers are probably the most flexible. So, and you can use them to configure your flow to only run when an event in a cloud service happens. So this could be maybe a new member being added to a team in Microsoft Teams, or a new item being added to a SharePoint list, or even a new shift request coming in shifts for Teams. Next, we have actions. This can be connecting to a cloud service and taking some sort of action through a connector, or an action can occur locally within the actual flow. So maybe it's initializing a variable or doing some sort of data manipulation in the Power Automate. And then there's the conditional logic. So your typical branching or looping scenarios you would expect out of a workflow tool. And you can see the condition on the screen. And so if that condition is met, you can branch your Power Automate to go and do a certain set of actions. If the condition is not met, you can go do a different set of actions. Now, I mentioned that in Power Automate, you get access to these 400 plus different connectors. They're both first-party and third-party connectors. And these connectors give you access to hundreds of triggers and thousands of actions. And so each connector has a set of triggers and actions associated with them. And this makes Power Automate super flexible in terms of what you can do with it and the systems that you can automate around. The last thing I'll mention on Power Automate is that there are a ton of pre-built templates available to you. So you can really get started quickly with some automation, and you can always go in and customize these templates to further meet your business requirements as well. So they can be a great starting point as you're learning Power Automate. All right, so next we'll get into the use case. Before we do that, I'll pause again and ask if there's any questions in the chat or in the Q&A around Power Automate.
No new questions, Andrew. Thank you for asking. I do want to call out that there's also a connector for Fire, so that you can bring in data from your EMR into the Power Platform. Some of our customers heavily utilize that in their workflows, and I'll drop a link for that in chat here shortly.
A great call out. Thank you, Vasu. All right, so let's switch gears to talking about a particular use case where we can kind of enable this automated role-based scheduling. And so we can imagine that we work for an organization or a healthcare provider, and we're trying to manage the volunteer scheduling process within a COVID vaccination clinic. So we might have one clinic or maybe multiple clinics, but we want to manage how volunteers can actually sign up to work in this vaccination clinic. Now, in the clinic, there's multiple roles that a volunteer can fill. So they can sign up to be a vaccinator who's actually administering vaccines to those who come to the clinic, the observer who watches those who have received vaccines for a set period of time after vaccination, a runner who is bringing supplies, to different stations and to different vaccinators around the clinic, the documenter who tracks who is receiving what vaccines, and then check-in support who's there to, of course, check people into the clinic and make sure things are running smoothly. Now, one thing to note here is that each different role requires a different set of qualifications. So, for example, to sign up for a vaccinator shift in this COVID vaccination clinic, you might have to be a nurse, a doctor, a medical student, nursing student, pharmacist, and so these qualifications must be met for you to sign up for a particular shift. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about this role-based scheduling management, is the fact that there could be multiple positions that require different qualifications for people to sign up for. Now, the observer and the documenter might also have a smaller set of kind of qualifications that have to be met. And then the runner and the check-in support likely don't necessarily need to meet any qualifications for someone to actually sign up for one of these different types of shifts. So our goal is to, again, automate this process of checking to make sure that whoever signs up for one of these shifts is actually qualified to sign up for the shift they want in the clinic. And then we also are going to add another detail here, and we're going to say that the shifts must first be filled by employees who won't be working overtime if they sign up for a shift. So if 2 employees or volunteers sign up for one of these shifts, then we have to give that shift first to the employee who would not be forced to work overtime when they sign up. And we can also imagine that the organization is currently managing this scheduling process all through email. So we have a scheduling admin, and he goes and he puts together a list of all the shifts that are available for a given week, and he sends it out through email to the pool of people who have signed up to volunteer, and then they respond to him what shifts they want, and then he has to manually go and check to see if they're qualified, and then if the shift's going to put them into overtime, and then correspond through email to kind of verify with the volunteer. So you can imagine how convoluted this manual process is and really how inefficient it is. So before I get into the demo, these are the 2 personas that I'm going to be switching back and forth between. So we have Jeff H, and Jeff H will be the scheduling admin who is in charge of putting together the schedule on a weekly basis for this clinic. And then Amy A, who is a MD. She's volunteered to work at this vaccination clinic and sign up for shifts there as well. So with that, I am going to switch over into the demo, and I'm logged in here as Jeff H. And so the first kind of step in this process is thinking about where we're going to store this volunteer data. So this is data that contains information about all of those people within the organization who have signed up to volunteer within this clinic. And so I'm storing it in SharePoint. So you can see I'm storing basic information about the person, first name, the last name. And then I also have this grid here that lets me understand kind of what their prefix or what their title is, so I can see if they're qualified for a given shift. Now, notice that Amy is an MD, but there are others who have signed up to volunteer who might not actually have meet any of these qualifications, but they can still sign up for the check-in support or the runner type shifts. Now I'm using SharePoint because it's a simple tabular data source. It has a very robust connector in Power Automate as well, so it's very easy to interact with this data. So once I have my volunteer data stored somewhere, I can go into Teams and I can create a team, because again, a team is the starting point for every shift schedule. So I've created this vaccine volunteer coordination team that you see here. And if I go in to manage this team, you'll notice that Jeff is the owner of the team, so he'll be the admin of that schedule that's going to get created in shifts. And then everyone who is on that SharePoint list has been added as a member of the team here. What I can do next is I can go into the Shifts app. So let me zoom in a little bit, and I'll go into the Shifts app. I can access the Shifts app just like I would find any other app in Teams. I can see it here in my recents. I can also just search for it. And when I open up the Shifts app, I'm brought into the schedule that has been created for the vaccine volunteer coordination team. So right now I'm looking at the schedule that's specific to that team. If I had other teams that had schedules, I could go in and I could switch between schedules for different teams, but I've only created one schedule and it's for this vaccine volunteer coordination team. So it's going to only show me the schedule. Now in this schedule, you can see that I have one group. The group is called Vaccination Clinic A, and this is the clinic that we're trying to manage the scheduling process for. Now I can create new groups pretty easily through the UI here in Shifts by just coming in, clicking on Add Group. I will add the group here. You can see how it gets its own unique schedule, and I can add people to this schedule as well. All done right through the UI. I could add someone and just like almost like adding them to the team itself. Now I'll delete this group because we don't need it, but just wanted to show how you can create those groups and add people to them. Now, in some instances, we could imagine if we had maybe 100 people who wanted to volunteer at this COVID vaccination clinic, it might not make sense to add them all through the UI. That would take a long time. Again, that's a manual process. We might miss people. We might add people that, to the wrong clinics to volunteer at. And so what we can do is we can automate that process of adding people to these groups, again, with Power Automate. I talked about extending teams and customizing teams with Power Automate or with the Graph API. And so I've created a Power Automate here called Create Shifts Group. And what this Power Automate does is it's manually triggered, meaning that I have to come in and explicitly tell it to run. And then once it's triggered, it goes out to that SharePoint list. So it goes out to the volunteer data SharePoint list, and it gets all of the items from that SharePoint list using the SharePoint connector. And then it loops through each item and adds them to array. And then the last step is actually making a call to the Graph API using the HTTP with Azure AD connector. We're making a call to the Graph API. And we're using the scheduling groups endpoint and passing in the team ID where we want to create a scheduling group. And you can see that this is how I created the Vaccination Clinic A group in my Shifts calendar. So that's how we created this group. Now I can come in here and I can run this again to maybe create another scheduling group. So if we had multiple clinics and we had to add these users to multiple clinics, I could just change this and run the Power Automate. So I'll run this real quick. It should only take maybe 15 seconds or so to run. So I'll run that flow. And we can see it running in real time here. Now it's looping through the users, and then it will go and actually create that group. Okay, so I can see that that ran successfully. So if I go back to my Shifts calendar and refresh this, we should see that new Vaccination Clinic B group there in the shift schedule. There we go. So now we have our new group. So that's one easy way that you can use Power Automate to automate the process of creating these groups to, again, avoid a manual kind of error-prone task. Now, we're only focusing on one clinic here, so we'll actually delete this group that we just created. And now we have our group, we have our team, we've added our members to the group. And so you can see I've already created shifts. Now, when I go to create an open shift, I can come into the open shifts section here. I can click in here and add a new open shift. So maybe I want to add a second vaccinator shift for tomorrow, September 16th. I can come in here, add a shift, and color code it. So there's some colors and theming that you can add for these shifts, which is really nice way for your employees to understand what type of shift they're actually signing up for. So I'll add a dark pink shift. We can specify how many open slots there's going to be for this open shift. So maybe we need 5 vaccinator 2s. So I'll change this to 5. And then we can add a custom label for these different shifts. So I'll call this the vaccinator 2. And we could add shift notes or even add specific activities that we want someone to kind of track while they're doing one of these shifts. I'll leave those blank for now and save this. And so you can see that this shift has been added to the open shifts here. Now it hasn't been saved, which is denoted by this star. So as a manager, I can go and share this with my team, or as Jeff H, the scheduling admin. And when I go to share it with my team, you'll see that I'm sharing a specific date range. If I only want to share one day, I can do that as well, or if I just want to share a couple of days, but I'll share the entire week. And it shows me how many open shifts and shifts are being shared. So I'll share this, and now that second vaccinator shift is available for all of these employees to sign up for. I could also come in and give these team members or group members shifts directly. So if I wanted to give Alicia a shift, I can easily come in here and add a shift, fill out the information, and save that to her calendar, and that will go directly to Alicia there. Okay, so now we have our team, our groups, our shifts. Everything's been configured by the scheduling admin. You can notice how they're all color coded, so it's really easy for an employee to understand kind of which different shifts they might be signing up for. These colors can also be picked up by Power Automate, so it's an actual property of the shift. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to switch over and switch personas to Amy. And you can notice that Amy is a member of this group, and so she can come in and sign up for any of these shifts that have been shared with the group of volunteers. So I'll switch over to Amy. And before I get into kind of continuing with the presentation from Amy's perspective, I'll pause again and ask Vasu if there's any questions or comments that have come up in the chat.
There's a question, Andrew, from Sean asking whether we can use Azure Active Directory versus a SharePoint list to pull the role information. I guess the assumption here is that Azure AD has some custom fields that outline either the skill sets or maybe department or geography, any type of a tag. Is there a reason for wanting to use a SharePoint list versus pulling that data from a user's profile? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so if you're just looking to add those users from Azure Active Directory into the Teams group, then yes, you can absolutely do that. Really, all I was using in the actual Power Automate was the object ID of the user. If you look through what's actually being passed when we're creating the scheduling group, it is the object IDs of the user. So that's all stored in Azure Active Directory. So you wouldn't need to store the data in SharePoint unless you wanted a way to kind of track, like, obviously, all of the people who had signed up to volunteer.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yep, great question. Okay, so going back, I'll switch back, and again, now I'm logged in as Amy, and Amy is one of the people who assigned to volunteer. Now she's been added to this vaccine volunteer coordination team here. So now when Amy goes in and she opens up the Shifts app, she gets a very similar view. or right, she can come in, I'll zoom out a little bit, and she can see all of the open shifts that she could request to sign up for. She can see her shifts down here as well. So she has a shift on Friday to be a vaccinator, but no other shifts. She can see that vaccinator 2 shift that was recently published by Jeff H. She can also switch her view and maybe look at the rest of her team's shifts. So if she wants to switch over and take a look at team shifts, she can see the shifts from everybody on the rest of the team, and she could easily come in here and request to swap these with others. But I'll switch back to only Amy's shifts. And so as Amy, she doesn't get to see necessarily how many open slots there are for a particular open shift or how many requests have been made like Jeff can, but she can come in and she can request one of these shifts. So maybe she also wants to be a vaccinator on Saturday the 18th. So she has a vaccinator shift on Friday already, but we'll go in and request a vaccinator shift for Saturday the 18th. Now, when Amy goes and requests this shift, we want to automate 2 things. First off, we want to make sure that Amy won't be put into overtime by taking on the shift. If you remember, that was one of the requirements. And then secondly, we need to check what shift she's signing up for. So this is a vaccinator shift. And we have to make sure that she meets our kind of minimum qualifications to take on this shift in the clinic. So those are the 2 things we want to automate. So I'll go ahead and I'll request this, and then I'm going to switch back over to Jeff H, the scheduling admin. So I click request, switch back over to Jeff. Now, as the scheduling admin, I've also created another Power Automate. And this is the Power Automate for automating those 2 things that I just mentioned. So let me switch over to that. So this is the OpenShift Approval Power Automate. And you can see that this Power Automate is triggered when an OpenShift request is created, updated, or deleted. And so right when Amy went and submitted that OpenShift request, this Power Automate was triggered. And what it does is it goes in and it gets some details about the shift, the OpenShift request, the user, and then also it posts a choice of options as the Flowbot to the user. So what this step does is it sends an adaptive card in Teams that allows that end user or the volunteer to either approve that this request will not put them into overtime or reject if the request will put them into overtime. And so right when Amy submitted that, she should have got a notification in Teams asking her to either approve or reject the fact that this shift will put her into overtime. So let me go back in here to Amy's view. So I'm switching back now to Amy, and you can see that a chat has arrived here. And if I go in, I see this adaptive card has come and it says additional validations required. Wants me to approve or reject this here. And so this is right after she has created that OpenShift request, she can come in and approve this or reject it. To keep the Power Automate running, of course, I will approve this. And so once I approve this, the next thing that needs to happen is before we actually approve that OpenShift request, we need to make sure that Amy is qualified for a vaccinator shift in the COVID vaccination clinic. So I'll click submit, and I'm going to go back to the Power Automate. So back to Jeff H here. And the next thing that the Power Automate is going to do is it's going to go and look up the SharePoint, go grab Amy's item here. Again, this is one reason actually we might want to consider storing the details in SharePoint is if you don't have details that are about each volunteer, each user that are crucial to understanding, if they're qualified for one of these roles, that might be a reason to store it in SharePoint where you can add those details. But this is where we really infuse our custom business logic into the Power Automate. And so for this use case, obviously what we're going to do is just check to see if Amy is an MD, a nurse, a student, a pharmacist, and make sure she's qualified to administer those vaccines. Now, your business processes might be different, but it's very easy to infuse this custom business logic into these workflows and to do these approvals and validations in Power Automate. So this is just custom business logic here. It goes through, finds the item, checks to make sure that Amy's qualified, And then the last step is approving this OpenShift request. So if I go back to the Power Automate, I go into the OpenShift request Power Automate that I was just showing. I can see the 28-day run history. I can see that this was ran 3 minutes ago and it succeeded. And if I drill into the particular run, I can get details about the run itself. And I can go down to the last step and I can see that this OpenShift request was approved. I can look at some details here. So if I go back now to the shifts view, I'll go into Teams, and here I'm logged in as Jeff H. And if I go into my requests, I can see that this request came in when Amy actually requested it a few minutes ago, and then it was approved automatically by the Power Automate, and that we sent her this note along with the approval, letting her know that this has been approved and we're looking forward to seeing her on that specific date. If I go back to the schedule, I should see that shift has been added for Saturday the 18th, the vaccinator shift here for Amy, which I do. And so if I go now to Amy's view, and I go back into the shifts calendar, I can see that now she also has that. Let me actually zoom out a little bit, but she also has that vaccinator shift now on the 18th. And if I go to her request, she also sees that her request has been approved. And so that is how you can start thinking about automating that role-based scheduling in Teams using both Power Automate and shifts for Teams. And your business requirements and your use case might not be identical, but hopefully this gives you a good idea of how you can go about that automation for these role-based scheduling processes. So let me pause again and open it up to any questions that people might have about anything that we have kind of covered here today.
Thank you, Andrew. Just a few sort of open-ended questions, if I may.
Yeah.
Can you walk us back to the approval workflow? I'm sorry, the attestation, where the employee is responsible for validating if they're overtime or not. For some of us who aren't really on the front line, can you maybe spend a few seconds talking about the importance of this step from a tracking point of view, from an auditing point of view, and then maybe even from a business logic point of view to say these people need to be paid, right?
Yeah, definitely. And so when it comes to this approval workflow, we would, if we didn't have this step in the workflow, then Jeff H, the scheduling admin, would need to go and manually check to see if this shift would be putting a specific employee into overtime. So adding this validation here allows that process to be completely automated, and it also kind of puts the responsibility on the actual volunteer who's signing up to attest to the fact that this request will not put them into overtime. Now, the nice thing about this adaptive card is that it's coming to that user right after they actually sign up for one of these open shifts. So they don't need to leave Teams. It all happens in one place. They can come here and then with one click either approve or reject that. And then our workflow can go down 2 different routes based on kind of what they choose. And then again, this is all tracked in the actual flow log. So you can go back and see what the user's response was here as well. Anything you want to add on to that, Sue?
I think you summed it up beautifully. I mean, it's often a requirement to track down the actual hours and the consent, and auditing is sort of important for those reasons. And you kind of hit the nail on the head. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. Another question that comes up is around what type of endpoints do we need to provide our first line worker staff to be able to use Teams and shifts? Are you only web-based? Are you only desktop-based? Or can you also load up Teams on like an iPad or a shared device or a mobile phone?
Yeah, so any any device that has access to a Teams client, whether it's the web client or it's Android or iOS. Now, the only thing you have to ensure is that the Shifts app is allowed in the Teams admin center. So you're allowing the Shifts app. And then you can also create a app setup policy. So if you want to push this Shifts app out to the side rail for your frontline workers, then you can do that as well through a setup policy. And you can create that in the Teams admin center.
That's excellent info, Andrew. Thank you. Can you take us back to the SharePoint list where you maintained sort of credentials alongside everybody's names? One question that we are, fielding here is, this looks like a static database. What's your recommendation for building a process that allows for new volunteers to sign up? Would you create a form, or would you create some kind of a mechanism to add line items to this list? And what's your easy recommendation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, there's multiple places to store this data, right? SharePoint's definitely not the only place, but in terms of creating a process to add new volunteers, I'm always a fan of keeping it as simple as possible. And so I think a simple Microsoft form with maybe even a Power Automate behind it that's triggered when a new form is submitted for a volunteer, and then creates a new item in this SharePoint list. And takes the data right off that form to create the item could be a really easy, convenient way to kind of keep updating your volunteer data.
Thank you. Somewhat more generically, can you speak to a few other areas in which shifts can be applicable in the healthcare clinical worker space? Any examples that you can share with the group here?
Yeah, and Basti, maybe you might want to take that one also. I know you have a lot of experience working with healthcare customers using shifts.
Totally. I was thinking about some informal resource management in some ways. So MRI machines or lab equipment. Instead of creating another mechanism, you can sign those up as open shifts, and whoever needs access to that equipment can quickly grab and go. Of course, the primary use case here is actually shift management. So if you have nurses, if you have social workers, if you have janitorial staff who are supposed to be aligned to a particular schedule, that's typically the primary use case. But I've seen in many areas people have sort of gone creative and substituted a user with another type of an entity. It could be an equipment or a facility or a location, and offered that up through shifts. I don't know, Andrew, if you want to add some more examples there.
Yeah, no, I think those are great examples, and I like the kind of out of the box thinking where this can also be applied to kind of equipment and equipment management as well.
Andrew, can you speak to the level of expertise and effort required to get started on something as simple as what you showed?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd say getting started using shifts for teams, right, there's not really any expertise that is required there. But when it comes to kind of automating around Microsoft shifts for teams and using Power Automate, you might need a little bit of expertise, but really not a lot. And the nice thing about Power Automate is it is really a tool that is intended to be used by anyone regardless of their technical background. So a lot of automation tools are kind of geared towards a more technical audience, but Power Automate is for business users just as much as it is for people with a more technical background. So there's really easy ways to get started using Power Automate. The Power Automates that I showed today are somewhat complex, but definitely are nothing that would be too far past beginner to learn how to do in a short manner of time.
Thanks, Andrew. I do also want to invite you to maybe talk a little bit about the Microsoft Technology Center and how you guys can support some of our customers. If you wouldn't mind maybe talking about what are the MTCs, how do you work closely with customer engagement and the Microsoft account team that supports customers. If you can maybe take a couple of minutes to talk about how best end users can engage with you?
Yes, definitely. So I don't have a slide to put up here, but across the United States, we have 15 different Microsoft Technology Centers. And so like I mentioned, the goal of these technology centers is to empower digital transformation through a set of deep technical engagement. So we have offerings from strategy briefings to hackathons to proof of concepts. And so if you're interested in engaging with a Microsoft Technology Center, you can always talk to your account team, and your account team can definitely get in touch with one of us. Again, we have 15 centers across the United States, so we're very geographically dispersed, and we can engage currently, right? We're doing it all virtually, but once we reopen, we can always do engagements in person as well.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Just a personal insert there. I found very meaningful solutions come out of each MTC engagement that I've been a part of. So want to add that personal endorsement to this call. We don't have any other questions. I'm guessing we can give people some time back. Was there any other closing remarks, Andrew, from you?
No other closing remarks from me. I just want to thank you for having me, Vasu, and I encourage everybody to take a look at Shifts for Teams, and if you're interested in learning more about Power Automate, it's easy to get started with. There's a lot of great training out there as well. You can go to MS Learn to find some great free training on Power Automate. But that is it for me. Thank you, Vasu.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for the wonderful demo. I do want to leave everybody with the fact that we will be posting the recording and the supplementing links on the HLS blog. So just be on the lookout for that. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to comment on the blog post. Thank you so much all for joining, and hope you all have a great day ahead. Thank you.